Welcome back. We got the special opportunity to speak with the president of the Organization for the Culture of Hispanic Origins about the relationship between Puerto Rico and the U.S. Let's take a look at why he's fighting for their freedom.
Determined to free his island from colonization, President of the Organization for Culture of Hispanic Origins, Walter Alomar, led a protest and testified at the United Nations on behalf of Puerto Rico. Alomar now joined me to discuss the relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico and what freedom looks like for the island. Walter, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, can you give me a little bit more info about the Organization for Culture of Hispanic Origins?
Of course, we're a nonprofit organization that we provide cultural, educational, and mental health services to the community. And a lot of the educational programs that we have one of the programs that we have consists of a documentary about Puerto Rico and the economic crisis, so that it kind of explains a little bit of the history between the island and the United States and what has transpired over the last over 120 years.
So I think that's super important because a lot of us, unfortunately, don't really know about that relationship. So can you educate our viewers about the history of Puerto Rico and how it became part of the U.S.?
Well, of course, it's not actually a part of the U.S. It's actually property. It's called a Commonwealth, but it's actually a colony, meaning it's a possession of the United States. So the U.S. invaded on July 25th, 1898, and under the flag of so-called freeing us from the Spanish crown. But it's been over 120 years, and we're still under the colonial rule of the United States. And because of the colonial rule, that's why the island is in the current status that it's in, because basically all the decisions that are made for the island are made by the United States. We have no vote for the presidency. Citizenship was forced upon us, and they basically dictate policy in Puerto Rico.
Now, what effect did this have on Puerto Rican culture?
Well, it had a big effect. There was a time when the United States first invaded Puerto Rico that it was illegal to fly the Puerto Rican flag. It was illegal to speak Spanish in school. It was illegal to discuss things of independence for the island. They sterilized over 35% of the women in Puerto Rico, 10% of the population of the men population. They invaded the island of Vieques, and it's been used as a bombing range over the last 60 years, and it has the highest cancer rate in all of Puerto Rico. So they basically just came in, took over the island, and used it for their needs, and created basically a tax haven for the U.S. Corporations. And the people have been suffering because of that, because we're just basically in limbo, and they decide our fate and our future.
Okay, so to clarify just about the relationship, is it similar to how we see with other islands, how maybe Britain, they're owned by Britain. Is that kind of like what we're seeing with Puerto Rico?
Yes, it's kind of that same line. Like Jamaica is seeking reparations, and the other nations throughout the Caribbean. So it's an ongoing thing. There are, I believe, about 17 colonies between Britain and the United States that are still present and are still looking for their liberation, and Puerto Rico is one of them.
Wow, thank you so much for clarifying that because I actually didn't know that. Now, how is Puerto Rico still seeing those effects today?
Well, today, with Hurricane Maria recently, a couple of years ago, that was a big wake-up call for a lot of the people on the island. The United States, basically, like I said, dictates policy in Puerto Rico. So the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA were basically delegating how things were going to operate in Puerto Rico. Shipping containers that were sent with food, medicine, water, things like that were being put by the wayside because they had to be inspected for, alleged drugs and things like that. And we basically just have to wait for them to give us everything that we need or that we want. And it's a big factor. The electrical grid that is basically antiquated, it needs to be upgraded. And we have to rely on federal funds from the U.S. in order to do that. So again, it all just comes back down to us waiting to receive some form of assistance from the United States.
Now, you brought it up a little bit earlier, but I kind of want to talk about it because I think it's so important and people should know about this. Much like we've seen in other parts of history, Puerto Ricans were abused by the healthcare system.
Yeah.
For those who are not familiar, can you expand on what happened to Puerto Rican women and even men?
Well, there's also a documentary out that's called La Operación, and it was done by an actual physician in Puerto Rico. And she shows how the government went around to the poorest neighborhoods in all of Puerto Rico, talking to people and saying, listen, we understand that you guys are impoverished, but you guys are Catholic and you don't believe in birth control. We have a method that will allow you to continue your lifestyle without having children. It's a simple procedure. And if you are okay with that, we'll provide it free of charge. So many of our people, of course, who were poor at the time, they fell right into line. And that was something that was done in the 1950s and 60s, and it carried over into the U.S. Once that was discovered, they landed here in New York City in Lincoln Hospital and in Brooklyn, and they did it to people of color. So the sterilization of people of color is part of American history.
And can you talk about how, like, although this happened decades ago, how we're still seeing the effects of that in our communities, and how there's a little bit of a distrust within communities of color when it comes to healthcare?
Well, in approximately 13 towns in Puerto Rico, there are no small children because of the sterilization. And also because of that, that's another reason why people were so concerned with the vaccines that were given out in Puerto Rico, because we have that history. The birth control pill was also something that was created, and it was experimented to Puerto Rican women first. So, we have that history, the sterilization, birth control, and now vaccines that are, being offered free of charge. People are reluctant because you have that bad history of basically contaminating or poisoning the people.
Now, speaking of this history, today you are fighting for the decolonization of your island. What does that mean, and what does it look like for Puerto Rico?
Well, for me, it means independence. It means freedom for my people in my community. We've been under colonial rule for 500 years, first under Spain and then now under the United States. And the island is dying. The gentrification, the sterilization, it's basically genocide that's happening to our people on the island. And it is time for a change. It is time for freedom. So I've been down to the United Nations so that I can discuss this and I can explain this to the council, to the world, the other leaders of the world, Western Sahara, the Russian Federation, Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, all these leaders of the world, to explain to them that the colonization of Puerto Rico is illegal. Okay, in 1960, it was declared that a foreign nation maintaining a colony is a violation of human rights. And this is something that we push the United Nations to enforce and get the U.S. out of Puerto Rico.
Now, I understand that you have been doing this for a few years now. Why do you think it's taking a little bit longer than you would like?
Well, it's going to take some time. It's politics. We're dealing with politics in this country, and unfortunately, one hand washes the other. And we don't practice the politics, let's say the conventional politics, like voting for presidents and things like that, because we're not American citizens, so we don't have that right. But it's also the United Nations receives all of its funding from the United States. So we are lobbying to get the United States out of Puerto Rico. The United States doesn't want to leave because of its tax havens and the debt that they have acquired in Puerto Rico. And we're asking the UN to get rid of them, to push them out. And of course, they don't want to back the hand that feeds them.
Now, you talked about gentrification a little bit, and I really want to talk about that because it's so important. A lot of islands are dealing with tourists, and it's known as a vacation spot. How is that actually affecting the people of Puerto Rico? I hear sometimes people say, well, it's good because it helps people and it gives them jobs. But I would really like to hear, how does it truly affect the people of Puerto Rico?
Well, it's pushing us out of our own neighborhoods. It's the same thing that's happening here, in the Bronx and Brooklyn and Bed-Stuy and the South Bronx, things like that. We can afford to live only in certain areas, and those areas are underdeveloped because it's a neighborhood of Black and brown folks. So now when the dominant culture decides, hey, we want to come in and this could be a nice area because there's beaches over here and there's access to such and such and such and such, we get pushed out. So now we have nowhere to go, and so it's not leaving us with any out. Now, yes, it may create a job because they create a Starbucks or they create another Walmart or a Target. Okay, but at the same time, we're being pushed out of our own neighborhoods, and we can't afford to live anywhere else because the cost of living is just as expensive as the cost of living here in the U.S. And the income in Puerto Rico is a lot lower than it is here in the United States. So we're basically losing our island. Everyone is coming from all different nations, and they're coming into the island, and they're taking over. They're owning businesses. They're pushing us out, and we're basically going to become a serving class in our own country.
Now, what will it take to restore Puerto Rico?
Well, I believe independence. We need independence for Puerto Rico. We need freedom. This country, it preaches freedom, democracy for all, but yet it has a colony, 1,500 1,500 miles off the shores of the United States. I believe in freedom. I believe that if Puerto Rico becomes a free nation, that we would be in a position then to do business with the rest of the world. Because as of right now, we can't do business with any of the other countries. 85% of what's consumed in Puerto Rico has to be imported by U.S. ships. Now, it's a tropical island. That island, we can grow anything. And we are not allowed to do business with another nation, with Cuba, with China, with Japan, with Europe, with Russia. We can't do business with any other nation without the United States permission, and they have to oversee that. So in doing so, we cannot trade. We cannot do anything. We have to basically just wait for them to give us whatever it is that we are required. And they give it to us when they want to give it to us and how they want to give it to us.
Now, I don't think too many people, unfortunately, truly know about the situation that's happening. What can people do to further educate themselves on this topic? And how can they also help within this fight?
Well, we live in the age of information. Right now, it's not like before. It's not like when I was a child growing up and you had to, go into the libraries or the Congress and the halls of Congress and things like that to find documents. If we put our minds to it and we get on the computer, we get on our phones, and we can find out what's happening in your own country. Just Google certain things. What's happening with Puerto Rico? What's happening, with the Caribbean islands? And if people want to get involved, they can. There's many different groups that are out there that you can actually partake in. My group in particular, I can be reached by my website, www.theocho.net. And you can get involved with my group, or if not, there's several other groups that can get involved. And then we have to get the message out to the general public, because that's one of the main issues is that the general public is uninformed about what is currently happening in Puerto Rico. And with everything that's happening with this, but the negative side with the age of information is that we are bombarded with information. So there's too much going on. We're kept very busy. We're very distracted with the social media and everything that's going on in the press and the trials and so on and so forth. So it can become a little overwhelming because of it, but we just have to educate ourselves, because education is the key, is the foundation to growth.
Well, how can people get in contact with your organization so they can learn more?
Okay, well, if anyone is interested in knowing a little bit more about the work I do, and I also directed a film about Puerto Rico and the economic crisis. It's called Colonization is Extinction. And it basically explains everything that we just talked about in the history between Puerto Rico and the United States. They can go to www.theocho.net. My email is theocho.net@gmail.com. They can reach me anytime, 24 hours a day. I use the film as an educational tool, and I've screened it at Columbia University, the Social School of Silverman, Social School, I'm sorry, Monmouth University, Jersey City, Stockton University, and several film festivals all around the country. So if they're interested and they want to know more, please feel free to contact me anytime. I'd be more than happy to show them the way.
All right, Walter, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I hope to be back soon.
We want to give special thanks to Walter for this interview. This was a very eye-opening segment, and we hope to have Walter back on the show to further discuss what true independence would mean for Puerto Rico. We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.